It is 7:11. Newstalk Sauga 960. Raw, Mike Richards, David Bastel, and just a couple of seconds here, Ed Tubb of the Toronto Star, an assignment editor focused on crime and justice. And Ed is joining us here this morning simply because of what has happened over the weekend and just sort of an understanding as well. When we talk about some of these circumstances, a lot of it has to do with, certain data, which I'll be honest, for a lot of us who did not do well in school, when I see graphs like this, I'm like, oh no, I didn't study. I don't know what that means. I think it means we're getting a waterfall. Well, you hope the waterfall is going down, but to sort of figure out exactly what this is, and of course, Trinity Bellwoods was a big story on the weekend. We invite Ed Tubb to the show. Good morning, Ed. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning, guys.
Well, in looking at this, so on a regular basis before COVID-19 hits, what was the routine beforehand at the Star?
Well, I mean, beforehand at the Star, I'm going to the office every morning. So,
Right.
as an assignment editor, I don't know if your listeners know what an assignment editor does, but an assignment editor gets in the morning and has been paying attention to the news overnight and decides what the free reporters are going to be doing that day. So for me, that was a lot of crime, a lot of murders, things like that, and I'd be sending reporters out into the city to go cover that stuff. So that was before COVID hit, and since COVID hit, I've been using a lot of my skills with data. Chart making and all that kind of stuff. And that's what I've been doing a lot since COVID has hit, while still doing the other stuff.
So as opposed to we see like TV shows where there's the assignment editor and there's like, what's my story today? And you're like, well, I'll tell you, Johnson, you got to go to Scarborough. So is this a matter of you then basically now you got to put the shoes on and go out and do what sometimes you would assign people to do? Is it one of those cases?
No, not really. This is more something that I've been doing for a while. So I, for things like crime trends, murder trends, things like that, I'll break out the Excel myself, and have been tracking things. So we did some work last year on traffic deaths and traffic fatalities and traffic collisions and things like that. And I worked with David Ryder at City Hall on that, and we also got in touch with an epidemiologist to work on that. David Fissman, who's been in the news a fair bit lately. So that was some data work that we were doing back then that I was doing. And since then, sort of being in touch with some of the people we spoke to then, and that lets me keep doing the same kind of data work with Excel, Google Sheets, that kind of thing. And I've been keeping on that since COVID started because I got nothing else to do, basically.
Yeah, I hear you. And let's break down some of the numbers. I know we can't get into heavy detail on it, but when we're looking at the city of Toronto here in the last week, what are we seeing exactly as far as numbers are concerned? I know that there's been a lot of talk on the news and the newspapers that we have hit our plateau at one time, but the plateau doesn't seem to be going down like a lot of people had hoped. Even in some situations, it's starting to go north of the plateau. What is your breakdown of, I guess, the last 5 to 7 days before we get onto what happened at Trinity Bellwoods and what you maybe are predicting for that as well?
Well, it's exactly like you described. So through the start of this whole thing, from February through March through April, we were on an upward trajectory, and we kept going up on an upward trajectory until we kind of hit a peak. And this is mostly province-wide in mid-April. And a lot of people were projecting that once you hit that peak, it would go straight back down again the same speed, but it didn't. So for us, it kind of plateaued, especially in the city of Toronto. It stayed kind of high. So we had about 175 people in the city getting COVID every day, or at least getting reported every day. And then what happened in May is it started to go down until about May 15th. And since then, it's gone really quite sharply up again. And now we're, by my count, I do like a 7-day average. We're now back above the highest that we've ever had in the city of Toronto itself. Outside in the GTA is not gone up quite so much, and the rest of Ontario is pretty flat. So it's really, at least as far as the cases go, what I'm counting is it's mostly a jump up in Toronto. Now, but the thing about the Trinity Bellwoods situation is you're not going to see that for another week or more.
Yeah.
Because if there were people who were sick at Trinity Bellwoods, and they gave it to someone else, well, that someone else needs time to get sick. That takes a few days. The scientists say up to like 5 to 10 days. And then that person's gotta get tested, and that can take a couple more days. And then the local health units who monitor all this stuff, there's 34 of them across the province, and there's one in the city of Toronto. They then need to take that information and put it into their database, and then that's when I see it. And I see it when they post it to their website. So that whole thing can take, 7, 8, 10 days. And part of that is just because the disease takes that long to show up, and part of it is a bit of a delay in the way that the reporting system works. But so what I would say is, you want to look for that the impact of people going crazy over the weekend. You're going to be looking like next weekend and beyond that, and you might see the increase. So the increase we're seeing now is not from Trinity Bellwoods. It's from what was happening a week ago. Maybe it's Mother's Day. We had Dr. Eileen Davila mention Mother's Day in having an impact showing up in the data. So maybe that's what we're looking at rather than Trinity Bellwoods. And maybe this week we might see what happened over the long weekend. So, these things do come in, but it takes a while, and the lags make it hard to interpret.
We're in conversation with Ed Tubb from the Toronto Star here on Newstalk Sauga 960. And Ed, I guess the one thing too is, when you're looking at this kind of data that you look at sort of comparables or comparisons, you look at trends that would be more or less similar. But because this is, this global pandemic that we really don't have a lot of, the window has been so small that trying to make a comparable to other cities, other countries, it really doesn't. It's hard to make that fit, or is it? Is there a pattern that is more or less similar? Because I find that to make a comparison. In fact, I believe in Manitoba yesterday, and Dave, you can probably speak to this, being a Manitoban. I believe there's in their hospital system zero.
Correct.
So, but you cannot compare the city of Winnipeg to the GTA. I mean, even in terms of the numbers, it's not even in the same universe. So how I mean, again, from maybe a perspective of a WHO or a CDC, how, I guess you really probably can't do that or make a comparison to what is a similar look in a graph.
Well, I mean, you can look at just the raw numbers, and you see that we're months behind what Italy had, and then you can look at the way that Italy's slope of their chart, their numbers, like they grew through the day by day, and then they hit a peak, and then what they did after, and you can sort of say, okay, well then maybe that's going to happen with us. But of course, every city is different, like you say. So like in Toronto, a lot of people live in tiny little apartments with close contact, and that's not the case in a place like Edmonton, or that's not the case in a place like Manitoba. So maybe in a place like Manitoba where you got a backyard and you can, you're relatively close to outdoor spaces that are open, then maybe it's easier to stay out of contact when things open up again. And in Toronto, maybe that's not true. So plus Toronto has a subway, it's underground, the airflow is different in places like that. But I'm not an expert on this stuff. So, all I can say is, well, these are the ways in which Toronto might be a little bit different. I don't know how that impacts, and frankly, I don't know that a lot of people do, because it's a brand new disease, and we don't know as much as we'd like about it, because it's only been 4 months now, right?
Yeah, so true. And this might be a tough one, but it's all about opinion. And what we saw this weekend at Trinity on Saturday was vastly different than what we saw at Trinity on Sunday, which is probably good news. I personally wish Saturday never existed. I'm sure most of society had hoped that too. But if that sort of thing happens, are we looking at the possibility of government sitting there going, okay, well, maybe opening parks isn't a good idea, or can they go back on this? And what would that look like if this was the scenario moving forward?
Hard, that'd be hard.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, Toronto, we've had just terrible weather this year so far until about a week ago. So it was, it's relatively easy to stay inside when it's snowing out, right? It's a big ask for people across the city to, stay in their little apartments and not do anything when it's beautiful out. There's got to be a bit of a balance, I think. And it's not, obviously, thousands and thousands of people crowding together and hanging out and interacting with each other at the park is not something that's a good idea during a pandemic. But I don't see how the city can stop. Well, I don't see how any really government in Ontario can truly stop people who need to get outside from going somewhere. And if it's not the parks, it's the streets, and the streets aren't necessarily any better. And it's not like you can safely get on the subway and go out to Rouge Park, where there's plenty of space, if you live on Queen Street, right? Trinity Bellwoods is the largest park nearby. So, I mean, yeah, it was way too crowded, and that was not good. But I don't know where you're expecting those 50,000 people who live around that area to go outside if not there. I think there just needs to be I think everyone agrees now that there needs to be a degree of enforcement and of distancing and some way to make it safer.
I'd also think among the younger demographics, they're watching the news, every day, like everybody else. Certainly in the maybe not as much now, but there was a time where people were glued, and I don't think it was a healthy thing, where they're waiting for the numbers. And then finally, I would think the younger generation goes, okay, so there's 2,000 deaths in Ontario, 1,200 of them were in elder care. I'm not 65. I don't have any issues. I'm sure the percentage for me is 0.000 whatever. I'm going outside, I'm hanging with my friends, and I'm having a beer. And I think that, just looking at the pure numbers sometimes can be a little dangerous. And I think maybe if you went to the average age of Trinity Bellwoods, which again is a sort of a trendy hipster area, and it's going to be in the early 20s, they probably have this feeling that they're relatively, at least to themselves, immune, that indeed is not dangerous for them. But again, we know that you can be asymptomatic. There's a lot of things that can happen, but I don't know how you beat that in a society that is a me first one. We are given every freedom that you could ever imagine. In fact, that's why we saw people saying, that there was a conspiracy, and how dare they keep us in our houses, freedom first. I mean, as Dave mentioned, if you have to go back, I don't know if you can. I don't know with a mindset like that, if you can turn that, as they say, the horses have left the barn. I don't know if you go back to the other way.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think you can rightly criticize pretty much all levels of government in Ontario, at least, has been on the messaging on this stuff. So, I mean, when we are opening up parks again, it's hard to say, yeah, we're opening up parks, but don't go there, right? Like, don't go there, crowd around and do what you did before. In a way, I think it's understandable that someone who hasn't been, or has maybe stopped watching the news as much as they did at the start of this pandemic, might not be getting the nuance of what the message is at the moment. And if the message is the park is open, but don't go there and sit down and hang out with your friends and all that other stuff you used to do before, then I think that's got to be made a little bit clearer to young people. And maybe that's having people at the park to have signage or something like that explains it, or police there to enforce, to say that you're not going to be allowed to do what you used to be able to do before. Because at least on Saturday, I don't know that people realize that it wasn't back to normal again. You see people driving around and to go into their cottages and all these other stuff.
Yeah.
When they have access to their own green space. And like these kids are 20-something kids. I don't know that I'm necessarily surprised they're not paying close attention to what the chief medical officer of health is saying. It's hard to be that invested in staying on top of that stuff. So I think you got to find a way to get that message across in ways that are clearer to the people who need to see it.
Yeah, great point. By the way, Ed, thanks so much for joining us here this morning. As I said, I think at times it can be a little confusing, and I think you just laid out some of the reasons why there is that kind of confusion. But hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you again at some point. Like the good old days when they're just murders. Going back to the good stuff, and get a chance to talk about it. I thought you did a great job here this morning. We'd love to talk to you again.
Cheers. Yeah. No, I mean, those murders, they aren't stopping either.
No, they're not. That's the other thing too. It's like, what are you doing killing people? Was the pandemic not enough? Did you have to just add to the stats? But we will, again, really appreciate it if we get a
Thanks,
chance.
Ed.
That was awesome today.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Ed Tubb of the Toronto Star, the assignment editor, focused generally on crime and justice and obviously the COVID-19 data. He joined us here this morning explaining some of the numbers and just how we've been looking at the numbers and just sort of what's happening in the city. I thought it was great stuff here this morning. It is a little past 7:25.